Welcome to the Spoiler Alert podcast, and today we will be reviewing Willow with a special guest, Caitlin NAUD.
Hi, thank you for letting me be on here and talk about Willow, one of my all-time favorite movies. I'm honored.
So, Caitlin, talk to us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your dogs.
Well, my name is Caitlin. I'm 25. I'd consider myself to be an old soul, mainly because my all-time favorite movies, shows are all pretty much from like the 80s, hence Willow being one of my all-time favorites. My dogs, this is Plum, and then we have Pupper over here, Chihuahua, Pug Chihuahua mix. They also enjoy 80s movies, watching the 80s movies with me. So
Nice. Very, very cool. Well, before we get started, I'd just like to point out to everybody to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell, follow us on Instagram and Twitter and Spotify and wherever podcasts can be found. So Willow was this movie from 1988 that was directed by Ron Howard and produced by George Lucas. It's kind of like off the successes of Indiana Jones and Star Wars that, George Lucas kind of propped this movie up to be the next big thing. It has a very large cult following, people like Caitlin. And to me, like it kind of is like almost like Princess Bride, where a lot of people talk about how much they love Princess Bride from the 80s, just because like they saw it and just fell in love with it immediately. So how did you fall in love with the movie Willow?
Watching 80s movies, for example, like The Labyrinth and stuff like that, Dark Crystal, all those, great classics, during this time period, and you've even said this yourself, during this time period, a lot of these movies were just being kind of just spit out here and there. And I think Willow being a prime example of what I would consider an 80s classic. It just kind of hits all the key points. There's action in there, there's gore in there, there's romance in there. For me, that's kind of what I look for in movies, which is, it's kind of hard to hit all those key points to keep the interest going. But with all of those movies that were being spit out at the same time, I don't think Willow, and we did talk about this, got as much recognition as it should have. Mm-hmm. Now, if this movie were to come out, had come out before the others, I think it would have gotten a lot more recognition. There were supposed to be sequels, and actually, if you look, I believe there's 2 or 3 books, right? Is it?
I think so. And the Willow Disney Plus TV show is actually coming out later this year.
Yep. Yeah. And well, of course, I'm looking forward to that. Especially that relationship too with, it helped a lot having that relationship with George Lucas, because at 11 years old, Warwick Davis, or Willow, he was already in Star Wars starring as an Ewok. So he built that relationship with George Lucas so that at the age of 17, they had been talking about Munchkins, I believe, was going to be the name of Willow. And then they ended up couple years obviously later going on, he was 17, I believe, when Willow was filmed, but in it also, I think, little people were not really in movies back then as they kind of are now here and there. But it's great. I love it, which is another huge reason why I love and respect Willow so much.
The film begins with a prophecy of that a child will be born and would lead to the downfall of the evil queen Bavmorda, which is kind of like Jesus themes right away, which the child is born in a prison that the queen put all the pregnant ladies in, then they found the mark on the inside of its arm that matches with the prophecy. So they snuck her out of the castle and sent her down a river like Moses, which is, another one right off the bat. Two religious themes that just, fucks with people like me.
Yeah, well, coming from a non-religious background, I even know that, that sounds, it's eerily similar.
I pay attention to those things sometimes.
Well, if you think about it, maybe not necessarily Ron Howard as much as George Lucas for sure is into the more of the fantasy realm of filmmaking. His ideas are very much so fantasy. They're not really too much based on realism or, you know, fact. It's kind of that sci-fi fiction type of, you know, so to see those little bitty, you know, biblical things pop in here and there, I almost feel as though George Lucas is kind of poking fun here and there at it.
Oh yeah. Well, I don't know. I feel like a lot of artists just use religious themes into their work, whether they're religious or not. But then, so the baby's mother ends up dying because the baby got away. But at the end of the river, we're in a village full of Nelwyns, who are little people. It's just, you know, a village, their own community. They kind of just do their own thing. And then Willow is played by Warwick Davis, who we spoke of a little bit ago. Willow's children find the baby and takes it in and kind of like cares for it for a couple days. Like shortly after that, like an attack on the village by these kind of like wolves that have rat tails type of things. And
those are real dogs in costumes, am I right?
I would think so, yeah. I think they threw some like shag carpet on it.
Yeah.
but those things are kind of cool. I like yeah, and
totally 80s.
It definitely has an aesthetic that's like, you know, like a cool kind of creepy.
Yes.
Where yes, that we've talked about, like Dark Crystal and stuff.
Nowadays CGI versus back in the day it was actual people in suits, which is my personal preference.
Mm-hmm. I think the more you can do practically, the better too. They decide that, you know, let's turn in this baby and see what the council thinks and this and that. So they take it to a sorcerer in the town who ends up enlisting Willow to return the baby what do they call humans?
Daikinis. So it's essentially the High Eldwyn, tells them, you know, he consults the bones and the bones say nothing. But he essentially says, yeah, you're going to have to take this Daikini baby to the Daikini crossroads, I believe. And essentially give the baby to the first Daikini they come across, which happens to be Val Kilmer, aka Mad Mortigan, which is comes into play.
They enlist like a couple other people to help go with them on this journey too. A couple of warriors, one asshole that is like
verbal cut.
That yes, he's like Willow's landlord, kind of sorta, and it's always just giving him shit, and just an asshole. But they come up across this, you know, this warrior, like, or not, I guess I can't tell he's a warrior, but Val Kilmer in a cage.
Yeah, bird cage.
In a bird cage, yep, bird cage. And then we figure out later that Kilmer's character is named Mad Mardigan, so we'll call him Mad Mardigan. But he is just like trying to negotiate for water and like, hey, I'll take the baby the rest of the way if you just give me some water or let me out, and this and that and this and that. To which I was a little confused with how this scene ended up. Well, I guess I wasn't confused, but I was like,
I understand kind of where you're getting at there. I mean, I had my boyfriend last night was watching it with me to kind of get a fresh perspective. He had never seen the movie before. So with first time watcher of the movie, he had even mentioned as well that scene was a little, they could have did a lot more with it. It was a tad bit confusing.
I guess the scene served to get Willow just kind of alone, or separate from the rest of the company that went with him, because Willow decided that, no, I don't want to have Mad Mardigan take the baby no matter what. Like, we should just take the baby. And then his companions decided, fuck Willow. And then they walked away. But then Willow ended up setting Mad Mardigan free anyway. And letting him take the baby anyway. So it's kind of unnecessary to separate from there, but like I get why they want to find a place to do that in the movie.
Yeah, the next scene was pretty much the baby was taken away by a hawk by the brownies anyway. So
yeah, that too.
And not only that, but it was a big missed opportunity. I was kind of looking back. That would have been a prime opportunity for us to get kind of a backstory of Mad Mardigan, because they really kind of hopped over that. Okay, he's a rogue guy who he doesn't serve. You know, at one point he was a part of this big, the greatest swordsman that ever lived. He was a part of this big army. Now all of a sudden he went rogue and he listens to no one. He serves no one. That's pretty much all we got out of that.
And I bet that's going to be something that's drawn out more in the show, and probably the books and things like that. I haven't read any of the books, but it's probably something they can dig into more in the form of a show. Like this kind of seems like a movie that's probably in a better form for like hour-long episodes, like 10 episode seasons kind of thing.
Well, and I did a little research on one of the books. So I guess the gist of the book that I read was essentially all about Elora Danan, the baby growing up, and what effect, what influence Willow had on her. She ended up growing up to be like this awesome warrior who's great with a sword, and it really just kind of goes into and really talks about how much of an influence Willow had on her. Mm-hmm. So I'm really excited to see that.
Yeah, and to see like what she becomes, because like she's supposed to, obviously be like a prophecy, like kind of. So
we'll be raised by Sorsha and Mad Mardigan too.
Right. Like you were saying, the baby got snatched by a hawk that brownies were riding, and brownies are these really, really tiny people that are probably like an inch or two tall. And they're pretty funny. Like they're kind of seen as like pests, but like they're still kind of a part of the crew at the end of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Again, I don't know why they had the French accent and how their names were Frenchie and Raoul.
They're good comedic relief throughout the movie. This is a point where I want to bring up ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, George Lucas's special effects company that he started back with Star Wars, and you did it with Indiana Jones, and all kinds of movies have been done with ILM, including this one where it kind of looks cheesy at this point in time, but the late 80s to the early 90s was on like sort of like a transition period of having like ambitious but cheesy visual effects into just straight up good special effects, or like good visual effects. Because like you had like The Abyss, I think also came out in 1988. That really like led to Terminator 2, which was a big visual effects, milestone type of movie, and then into Jurassic Park and so on.
Fun fact, I mean, I'm not sure if you knew this or not, but the actual the sounds, the actual music they used in Willow, you can actually hear that opening scene of music from Jurassic Park uses a lot of the soundtrack of Willow.
Really? I was gonna say something like I didn't think of that specifically, but the composer of Willow is James Horner, who's done stuff like Titanic, a bunch of James Cameron stuff. And then obviously the composer of Jurassic Park is John Williams, who has done almost every great soundtrack you can think of. But there was definitely similarities. It almost sounded like James Horner was doing his best John Williams in this movie. So that actually makes sense to me. I didn't know that specifically, but that makes sense. And then it turns out that the brownies were actually sent by a fairy queen, like kind of a good queen named Sherlindria.
He is told by Sherlindria that go find Rizal. She's been banished to this island by Bad Morta. And once you find her, take my wand and transform her back into her human form, because as we find out when Willow gets to this island, she is like a golden possum. She is this adorable little muskrat.
It ends up taking Willow quite some time
All the way up till the end, pretty much.
to get that spell figured out.
In his defense, though, he does make it very clear that he is a farmer and a training sorcerer.
He's like, I'm not qualified for this shit, but I'll give it my best shot. On their trail, it ends up raining, and they go to a pub to find shelter, and that's where they reconnect with Madmartigan, who is kind of being a bit of a house wrecker, trying to disguise himself by like dressing up as a woman. And then that's when Sorsha, who is like a badass like general of the bad kind of army, because she's actually Bev Morta's daughter.
Yes.
Shows up, and then they kind of have like, you can immediately tell that Madmartigan's into her. And then there's a big horse and cart chase. It was a pretty exciting chase, and kind of had the same kind of George Lucas or Steven Spielberg flair that Ron Howard brought to this one. So it was a pretty exciting point in the movie.
As when the wheels start like breaking off, and I honestly loved that part. For some reason, the effects of the wheels, going around and just, breaking and snapping off, and, the bumps in the road, they did a very good job.
Once they get to the location and find Rizal, who, like you said, is a muskrat, almost immediately after, the army shows up again, and it's clear that Madmartigan like sold them out to save his own skin. But then they were like, oh, we probably get him anyway.
Which again, they don't really go too much into detail about his backstory. So I was not expecting him to sell them out or anything like that, because we know that he's this rogue warrior guy, but we don't know just how bad of an individual that he is. And then we get little tidbits here and there of, oh, he sold him out, or he's feeding a baby blackroot, which I can only assume is something that's horrible to give a newborn baby, but he's just letting it chew on it. I don't know,
probably like the equivalent of a cigarette or something.
Yeah.
So at this point, some of my notes are that, like, Willow and them are captured. There's more and more sexual tension between Madmartigan and Sorsha at this point,
due to that whole what is it, the dust of broken hearts that he gets from the brownies get from the fairies, because they smack him in the face with it, and then it just poofs in his face, and then all of a sudden he's just head over heels in love for Sorsha.
Because for a while he actually looked high too. Like, he didn't look like it was just a love potion.
Well, and that's again that there's certainly missed explanations, because, for example, Raoul gets hit with the dust of broken hearts, and he falls for that cat at the pub, but then it quickly wears off. But for some reason, you get a little bit of explanation as far as Madmartigan that wears off, and then all of a sudden he's still kind of head over heels for her. So.
Oh, maybe the brownie is still in love with the cat and going to come back for it at some point.
I mean, he did say he liked their whiskers, so could be in the next, Are all those characters still alive? Are they all still around? Val Kilmer, which more than likely would be voiced by, again, his son, as we're seeing Top Gun Maverick movie. He's acting in it, but his son is voicing,
Yeah, I'm not sure what the whole cast is going to end up being, but I just know Warwick Davis is in it, and I think some of his family are in it.
Okay.
Could be other like Nelwyn's. At this point, Willow tries to bring Roselle back and turns her into a raven. So that, was kind of like a fail. Yeah, so after Madmartigan gets high on the love dust again, he goes and kind of rescues, Willow, and kind of breaks out and they get the baby back again, basically. And then they go sledding down a hill, which kind of like in a good way felt like in Indiana Jones, nice like transition scene where
it was a great. I thoroughly enjoyed that scene. And at the end where Madmartigan kind of falls off the sled and turns into that big rolling ball of snow, again, great typical 80s type of effects going on there. I loved it. I thought it was hysterical.
In that whole like fray, there's also like a bit of a battle going on where Madmartigan meets up again with an old comrade who is like leading an army that got slaughtered earlier in the movie when he was still in the cage. When they all start attacking, that's kind of their window to rush out with the baby, and they escape with Alora. And then soon after that, they arrive at an abandoned castle called Tir Asleen.
Tir Asleen.
Tir Asleen.
Tir Asleen.
Tir Asleen. Tir Asleen.
Yeah,
at that time, there's signs of trolls, and at this point too, Willow turns Roselle into a goat.
In that scene, at the very beginning when the High Eldwin gives Willow those acorns that are supposedly supposed to turn anything into stone, right? There is nothing that made me more angry than I thought there was going to be a bigger
those.
Yes, because you get him dropping one of them on the boardwalk and the board turns to stone, and then boom, that's short-lived. Later on, you'll see he uses the other acorn one more time, and again, short-lived, turns, it's thrown, grabbed, turned to dust. Doesn't take much effect.
Yeah.
Anger.
There's a theory in like film and plays called, I think it's Chekhov's gun. Maybe it's someone else's gun. It's like a Russian person's gun, where it's just like a film theory thing where you don't introduce something new to a movie or a show or a script unless something's going to be used. So in a movie or a play, if a gun is introduced in that movie, that gun's going to be used at some point. So I agree with you there. That's another one of my kind of criticisms that like add up a little bit, where it's like nothing really came out of that. Like it's just,
when High Eldwin gives you something, you're under the impression that that's gonna come into play at some point in this movie, and it's really gonna just knock our socks off. Complete opposite. Totally just could have cut those scenes out.
It's honestly like life advice when you're a kid. Like it sounds great, you're gonna use it, and then when it's time to use it, it's like, oh shit, no, life doesn't work like that.
Nope. Yep. Exactly.
Maybe they were on to something, but no, we should have. Something cooler could have happened with that.
I saw there was a deleted scene when Willow was actually heading to that island to get Roselle. I guess it consisted of him being on that boat, and then halfway there he encounters a bald man with shark teeth, and he turns into a giant fish that tries to attack him on the boat. And of course it was a deleted scene because even the directors were like, this is just outrageous and just isn't needed. But yet the acorn scenes were left in.
I just wish there was a better outcome to it. Just like Kale's army attacks, and Kale is like the badass general that kind of worked next to and with Sorsha. He wears like a skull helmet, so a bunch of the Queen's soldiers are attacking into the Turrisline, and
I get a very the barbarian vibe from Kale. I don't know why.
yeah, I mean, it's like,
looking though,
Conan the Barbarian kind of stuff, yeah. And it's this part of the movie where Saoirse flip sides and betrays her mother and is kind of like now like fucking with Willow and Mad Mardigan. And
which again is one of those things where the movie was, how long was the movie? Do you know the exact?
2 hours and 6 minutes.
You know, I feel like it could have been maybe 2.5 hours.
That's what I was thinking too, but like that's like the tricky thing, and why for the longest time it was really hard to make movies in the 80s.
Well, the budget movie was what? Was it 35 million?
Yep, it was 30. Yeah, I was on the Wikipedia too. It was 35. It made about like 165, which wasn't as much as they were hoping, but
Right.
it still made its money back. But like in the 80s, no one had really made a hands down like all-time great fantasy movie that everyone can like agree on, kind of thing, that's like critically acclaimed and audiences rushed in, you know what I mean? Fantasy was always like riskier to do because there's also so much backstory in fantasy fiction. There's a lot of different characters and all of them. So that's why like Lord of the Rings didn't get done until the early 2000s, because like Willow.
Same place though, New Zealand.
Yep, they filmed a lot in New Zealand.
Willow, they actually said, was essentially shot all over the place. I mean, it was New Zealand. I mean, it was, I forget if it was Australia as well, but just all over the map. The same areas that they filmed, like Indiana Jones, and certain studios that were just everywhere. I got a very Lord of the Rings vibe from Willow. It was shocking that they were able to condense that movie down to only 2 hours and 6 minutes. That actually shocks me that it wasn't closer to 2 hours and 30 minutes. I mean, even in those roughly 25 extra more minutes, they could have accomplished a lot.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying is I think Lord of the Rings and like the new Dune have more of an advantage than their 80s counterparts, because in the 80s the studios would be like dead set on, okay, it's 2 hours because people aren't going to watch it if it's too long. The fallacy to that is if they have to condense it and rush things, it's not going to be quite as good as it could have been.
Like Game of Thrones.
Yes. Yes. So you may as well just have like a 3-hour movie that's like the way it should be, and have some people not go see it because they don't want to watch it for 3 hours. But it worked for Lord of the Rings. They made plenty of money.
They're still making money on that. I mean, I own every single Lord of the Rings and Hobbit movies. And like I said, I would have much rather preferred Willow to have been longer. And I think even though back in the 80s there were so many being spit out of these sci-fi fantasy type of, like Legend, for example, all these movies, Labyrinth, I think Krull as well, Krull, was also released during this time. All movies that were being spit out. And Willow had that opportunity to be bigger than it actually was, but it is what it is now. There's nothing we can do. But I still watch Willow all the time and think it's fantastic. So
yeah. That's the beauty of movies. So getting back into the movie, Willow ends up trying to cast a spell on a troll, but again, he's just a fucking farmer, just kind of faking it till he makes it about this whole sorcerer thing. So he ends up turning a troll into like this big like monster that they call the Ebersisk. The reason they call it the Ebersisk is because of Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel, because both of those guys didn't like the movie.
Kael was named after another critic of the movie as well.
Oh, is it Pauline Kael? Oh, that makes sense.
Yep.
Those are critics that I really respect, especially Pauline Kael. It is what it is. Maybe one day myself and Dakota are going to be big enough at this that we're not going to like a fantasy movie someday, and they're going to name creatures in that movie after us. I'm making that as a personal goal.
Well, Troll was even named after me. I would die happy with that. So like
with that.
Yeah.
But the Ebersisk basically is like a two-headed kind of dragon monster / like worm thing.
A dinosaur mixed with a God, what do they call that in ancient Greek mythology? That,
Hydra. It's a Hydra.
Yes.
And then Madmartigan ends up killing it. Turns out you only have to like kill one of them to kill both of them.
Again, something I think that was definitely a prime action scene that I've seen that was, they misused the time they had with that. They could have done a lot more with that, like something cooler, but again, time restraints, stuff like that.
Instead of like making it like an accidental thing that Willow does where he like turns a troll into a monster, it might be cooler if it's like a monster that like the evil queen summons from like the depths of hell or some shit, to add like a little more, danger, a little more suspense to it, rather than it's just, accident after accident.
That scene where he turns it accidentally into this ball of steaming hair that gets
that was
ripped.
Pretty cool.
It was pretty cool. It's a very 80s. I mean, even for the 80s, I think that was graphically executed beautifully. I really thought that was, I caught myself the other day watching it going like, wow, that was cool. Like, I like that type of gory stuff, and I thought that was awesome. So I thought it was cool when he kicked it. You're
just like, fuck that shit.
Yeah.
Maybe no one will notice.
Whoops. Yeah.
At the end of all of that, Kale does capture Allura again and takes her to a castle where the queen is preparing a ceremony to exile her soul from the earth and, make sure that the baby can't come back and threaten her hold on the throne. Eric, who was like the kind of Scandinavian looking dude that was, the colleague of Madmartigan, his army kind of is helping out, Willow and Madmartigan, and they're kind of planning a siege.
And he is eventually killed by Kale.
Yes, he's killed by Kale by the end of all of it. But before that happens, when they're preparing the siege, Bavmorda, she turns them all into pigs.
Which is another great scene.
Yep. And the only thing that really saves Willow from that is that Roselle kind of takes him into a tent and tells him to say a spell that kind of protects him for a while.
Yep.
And then he goes through like a whole, and then she's like, all right, now you're really going to fucking change me back to my normal form. And he ends up like taking her through like 10 different animals and different species until they finally get to Roselle's kind of humanoid form. And she's a lot older than she thought she would look, because she apparently got like transformed when she was like a young woman, and then it all went to hell.
Yeah, a young, beautiful woman, and then Madmartigan goes, "Transformer, Willow, come on, let's go." And yeah, she looks like everyone's grandma who's been through hell, smoked 2 packs of cigarettes a day, and she's seen some shit in her day, which makes sense.
They bring the pigs in one by one and make them back into normal, but they're hiding them in the tents. And then come morning, it's pretty much, I think it's just Willow, Roselle, and like the brownies or something were kind of walking onto the castle and challenging them. And then when their gates open and they rushed out with their horses, their cavalry to take them out, that's when they like surprise attacked. Since the gates are open, they were they hid like all their people like under these holes in the ground that they covered up so they can rush into the castle. And
Yeah, Willow constructed this ingenious idea that he had gophers back home at the village, and he could dig these holes under these fallen tarps and all that fun, which is honestly brilliant. I'm sure they did actually use tactics like that back in the day.
and then there's some intercutting between a scene kind of in the ceremony room where the baby is, and they're putting like the potion together. It requires like blood and hair and shit. And there Roselle and Sorsha are trying to, take out the queen. And then elsewhere, Eric is killed by Kale and Madmartigan is fighting Kale. Both Roselle and Sorsha are like stopped and sort of beaten by Bavmorda. So it's all up to Willow now. But elsewhere, Madmartigan kills Kale. So that's good. The top general's out. The scene here is actually kind of a callback to a scene that we didn't really mention from the first part of the movie. Willow's trying to be this sorcerer, right? So during like this like village get together, he does a disappearing trick with a pig in his home village.
Watching the beginning half of the movie when they're having that festival, which oddly enough reminds me a lot of the Bristol Renaissance Fair. But he does that disappearing pig trick where he puts a blanket over that piglet and he says a little enchantment, and then he pulls the blanket off and the pig's gone, ends up squealing, comes running out from underneath the table, haha, kind of gets thrown back into his face. But again, later on at the end, yeah, he puts Alora Dannon somewhere else, but then he ends up, faking putting a baby under this blanket, tells her, I'm a great sorcerer. I'll banish her to a place where evil can't touch her, does the same thing, boom, it works. And yeah, again, back to the misusage of the acorn thing. I mean, that could have totally been cut out, but she does get clumsy. Yeah, I mean, she just backs up, hits herself into the altar, and then just gets zapped up. Perfect timing when the baby was supposed to be in there at that point in time, and she just happened to back up into the altar at the perfect time. I don't really know. I wish there would have been more context to that. And it also looks like throughout the ritual, she's deteriorating more and more.
I don't know. Maybe maybe Alora's presence causes her to decay or something. You know what I mean?
That's why she needed to do that ritual.
Yeah, like even like as soon as it got born, as the movie goes on, we kind of see her. She looks older and older and older. So that might be
the ritual was taking that much out of her.
That could be.
I wish it would have been explained. Again, 25 minutes.
These are things that a TV show can solve, though. So
correct.
I do have hope. I have some hope for that. So then we kind of get to the resolution of the whole thing. Madmartigan and Sorsha end up taking care of Alora. Willow returns home to his family, and basically everyone there is hyped to see him except for the fucking asshole landlord who gets like bird shit on him.
Yeah.
And then that's kind of the end of the movie.
Yeah, he comes home and is, praised as this great, I don't want to say warrior, but he's praised as a hero.
A hero.
And looking back, if I was like the writer, like the script guy, I would have had Willow look at the sorcerer guy and say, like, can I be your apprentice now? Or how about now?
That would have been a cooler thing to go back to than like the landlord shtick again and again and again. The next things we usually break down in each of these episodes are place in society. We kind of went through that where it's, sort of a, kind of a cult classic now, sort of like, how like a lot of people really love, like we were talking about Never Ending Story and Princess Bride. A lot of people really like Willow in the same way. And where it's just a very lovable movie. It's not a perfect movie, but it's lovable.
As Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. I mean, especially like the Hobbit. The main character is just this regular guy who gets approached by Gandalf, really has no interest in doing this stuff, but he kind of gets thrown in, ends up doing great, similar to Willow. It's a very specific demographic of people like me who love these type of sci-fi to fantasy type of adventurous movies with, orcs and trolls and dragons and, people who like Game of Thrones. The reason Game of Thrones does so well is because, well, did very well until the last 2 seasons. But we have a lot of people in today's society that certain demographic is raising day by day. It's not just people who like Dungeons and Dragons. These people like me are out there that thoroughly enjoy those. I love, the dragons. I love the olden day castles, and the aesthetic is the adventure, the landscape. Like New Zealand is a beautiful place to film. And the fact that we know that these are real places that were not CGI, is great. And the soundtrack has a lot to do with it too. It's very adventurous and exciting, and it catches, it catches the eye, it catches the ears. It's just aesthetically and audio, it's just appealing, and it's great. Some people like gore, some people like action. A good portion, even to this day, from the 80s to now the 2020, we love sci-fi fantasy. We love it. We expect the type of things from the 80s to kind of be transitioned now over to movies these days. But I haven't really found, other than maybe The Hobbit, and even then CGI is kind of really taken over. You don't see like in the Lord of the Rings where it's actual men and women in suits. Why I prefer Lord of the Rings over The Hobbit, because it just turned into this huge CGI fiasco, which I don't personally find aesthetically pleasing anymore. But Hobbit is too much CGI versus Willow, actual people in costumes. And I think a lot of people even today really love that type of stuff.
Yeah, there's a little more humanity to it, a little more of an aesthetic. And even in like Lord of the Rings, when you see like the big landscapes and the castles and stuff, those are all miniatures. So they're like models that, they definitely layer the film itself, but like those are actual, like that's an actual kind of, most of those, even the landscapes are actual.
That was all I don't want to say claymation, but it was all made of clay.
And I love claymation too. Like if you go back to like old, like Wrath of the Titans and Clash of the Titans. The older like claymation ones, those movies are funny, and like maybe it's a little condescending to say, but but like they're funny like in their own way, and they're just cool. Like it's just cool to watch.
Stranger Things, for example, when I think, and I'm sure you've seen the latest season that came out with Vecna. Crazy, cool sci-fi character. The reason that character is doing so well and is just such a hit with everybody is because it's an actual guy in a suit. They're really hitting home with the graphics and everything. And realistically, maybe the only CGI that they're using is the background. It's an actual guy in the suit. Yeah. The special effects team did an incredible job on it, hence why it's doing so well. It's such a big hit with people. You don't really see a lot of that anymore, and that's what people like to see. I mean, you can just tell it's hitting that demographic. Exactly. And you saw that exploded. I mean, overnight it exploded.
I think you're right about that. I don't know. I haven't delved in too much of the making of that show, but I have found that when it comes to the individual characters, like if they can, they're gonna have as much real as they think as they can get away with.
More and more that these producers and writers and directors, I personally, I think that they're slowly learning again what the real demographic is and what are really big hits and what aren't. Prime example, Lord of the Rings was a massive hit. Nowadays, I think what people really want out of a good movie, they want a really good storyline. They enjoy the less CGI. I mean, don't get me wrong, CGI is great. It's cool, but it takes away the realism.
And I think some of the best fantasy writing ends up going to TV shows nowadays.
Yep.
Because when it comes to movies, like Hollywood and stuff, like there's way more at stake in having like a premiere and stuff like that. Like your first weekend can make or break a movie financially, because like Willow, for example, they didn't make as much money as they wanted to, because they kind of had a fairly competitive opening weekend. I think they went against Big. If you have like the biggest budget of that group, but like only come in like third in box office opening week, then what happens is they pull marketing. They don't spend as much on marketing, and then you're just going to slowly see it decline from there. I think Willow's done great in DVD sales and that kind of thing.
I own 2 DVDs of Willow, and they're the same DVD. I just wanted 2 copies of it.
We already brought up a couple, but if you liked Willow, what's something else you might like, Caitlin?
Labyrinth, Dark Crystal, Crawl, well, Lord of the Rings, Legend with Tom Cruise. Let's see here.
I'm gonna throw in Never Ending Story.
I own them all. Yep, Never Ending Story. I mean, the story was directed by Ron Howard, and George Lucas, of course, Star Wars. I mean, me personally, George Lucas holds a very deep place, a very big place in my heart, because I don't think I've ever watched a George Lucas film and not absolutely fallen in love with it. So I would recommend any of those movies I previously mentioned, or really anything written, directed by Ron Howard, or more importantly, George Lucas. He is a visionary, and the way that he is able to write things down on paper and then convey them into film and make them just works of art, to me personally, is a gift. Like Steven Spielberg is able to do it beautifully as well. Just artistic film geniuses.
Yeah. And now it comes to our ratings. Between 1 and 5 stars, Caitlin, what do you give Willow?
Well, for as much as I love the film, I do have some critiques, as we've all heard here. There are definitely some changes I would have made or would have liked to have seen. I love the storyline. I love the romance. It hit the points, like the bullet points of romance, gore, action, the graphics in there. I would give it probably on a 1 to 5, 4.5. Well, I'll do 4.
Okay.
I would give it a 4.5 if they would have cut the certain scenes out, and I probably would have given it a 5 if they would have extended to the 2.5-hour mark and explained certain things a little bit better.
So for me, Willow is not a movie I watched until literally actually quarantine, because I was like,
fell asleep watching Willow for years upon years. Fun fact, me and an ex-boyfriend of mine, we were so enthralled with Willow that we had even begun talking about if we had had a daughter, we would have named her Alora Dannon.
Damn.
So how important and how much I loved this movie.
That's awesome. But yeah. For me, like I didn't watch it until I was already like, old and like kind of like had a critical eye towards it. So like it didn't really catch me, like even maybe, even as much as like, the Never Ending Stories and even some of the other 80s ones that did catch me at that younger age. But I also want to recognize things that could have simply been better had they been given the opportunities, like a 3-hour runtime, or just all kinds of the things that we've been talking about. I do think there's a little bit of cliche and a little bit of not connected dots, like we talked about with the acorns and just certain things. So I think I was bouncing between a couple of ratings, but I think I'm pretty much settled on like 3 stars for me, where it's good, but I feel like it could have been better, either like if it was made a decade later, but then it wouldn't maybe have the same 80s feel to it. So it's tricky.
I mean, if they would have come out with and released the movie in the 90s, kind of like Lord of the Rings, you know what I mean?
Lord of the Rings really did hit the sweet spot where they waited, and then they got the runtime and they got the actors that they wanted, and just everything kind of hit the mark. And then I just feel like with this, whether it was in the control of the creators or not, there was just some things that didn't hit the mark.
And, I will say too, just as like an ending, Lord of the Rings took, God, years. And for them to accomplish what they did, it is pretty telling. It's kind of impressive with certain movies, what they can accomplish with less time versus, obviously nothing. I don't ever going to beat Lord of the Rings, quite honestly.
That's a pretty tough comparison.
Willow, like the shitty nephew to Lord of the Rings.
Willow, okay, you know what Willow is? They're the first pancake you make. First one always comes out a little wrinkly, little crappy. Yeah. You can still eat it. It still tastes like a pancake, but it's just not. Lord of the Rings is probably like the 3rd or 4th pancake that just smacks. Like
You're correct. You are absolutely correct.
On that note, I want to thank you again, Caitlin, for coming by the Spoiler Alert podcast. You're definitely welcome in the future. I'd like to tell everybody at home, whether they're listening on a podcast or if they're watching the video on YouTube, I recommend to check out both. Send likes, tell your friends. Tell your friends that are really into movies about us. We also have a Patreon, so fork over some money if you want. And then, but have a good day, everybody. Anything else to say to the good people at home, Caitlin?
Yeah, I want to say thank you to you, Nate, for allowing me to come on and, talk about Willow. I feel like I can die happy now. Please subscribe, comment, subscribe to Nate's channel here. I've watched quite a few of his videos. He's very talented, very articulate with his, constructive criticisms of the movies. And I would I'm a subscriber as well, so I highly recommend it to anybody out there.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, everybody listening. Have a great day.